So let's talk. You said something really interesting before. Let's talk a bit about First Amendment, because I think you are filling a void that big tech has not done themselves. And so this is, I believe in free speech. I think there's a reason it's first, and I think it's foundational to civilization in many ways, or like developed civilization today, and democracy in particular. But I believe that you can say whatever you want to extent, it's it's outside of, let's call, like, what's predefined legal hate speech. But what I don't like about big tech is that we've like leaned on that, but we've also leaned the other way, where we're like, but if people are free to say whatever they want, our algorithm is still going to distribute that nonsense like across our platforms too. And they're trying to figure it out, they being the Google, Facebook, Apples of the world. And what you've done is said, Apple, stop. Facebook, stop trying to, or in this case, Twitter, stop trying to be the First Amendment police here, and put it on the person. You're like, okay, people are saying whatever they want. I'm going to just filter out what I'm comfortable seeing, and I don't want to distribute it and share it in my face. Is that the future in your opinion, where it's going to be less on the big tech companies to filter this out, and more on us? I think people will actually be happy with that. It's kind of what you've done. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, there's so many things I want to address. The first is around like free speech, or allowing people to say what they want. I think a very simplistic interpretation of this is like, yes, everybody can just say what they want, and like we should aspire to that on platforms. And we don't put any sort of restrictions on what can be posted. And that's like the truest form of free speech. In practice, because of things like abuse and harassment, many people can't actually speak freely, because they know that if they speak, they will be inundated with harassment. And the repercussions to that are so much that people are self-silencing. And I sense this as well, like in my own posting online. I know there's certain topics that if I talk about them, the repercussions will be so negative that I will wish I had not done that. And so I'll preemptively hold back. And so that's not really freedom of speech then. Like,
No,
what you're
it's
doing is
not. That's a good
allowing
point.
the like unchecked abuse to silence certain people. And so even that conception of like First Amendment, like you should have freedom of speech, is flawed in that way. But building on that idea is this notion that it's not just speech. Like, there are repercussions to it. There are things that happen after the speech. And for a long time, we've kind of viewed the words or media that people post online as like, that's it, and not really understanding, or not understanding what are the ramifications of that. We got to see on January 6th some very clear ramifications of allowing people to post things and interact online. It's not just that they're sharing content with each other. Like, it does turn into offline world consequences. This brings me to a next point, which is that our governance models don't understand this. So when I talk about governance, it's both things like offline laws. So we have the Constitution, kind of, we've talked about First Amendment, Constitution, and other, like the other laws that apply in physical nation states and local jurisdictions. But there's also sort of like the governance of online worlds, where we don't really have the equivalent there. So there's laws offline. So if you do certain things that are illegal, that violate the laws, you may face repercussions for them. Online, we don't have an equivalent system of governance. And we also don't have a system of governance that contains both the offline and online worlds together, and understands that the ramifications of online speech can actually be, let's say, murder or insurrection. And because we don't have a system of law or governance that understands that, we're very limited right now to trying to appeal to offline world systems of governance. Like, are there some laws that you have violated in the offline world? So have you like incited an insurrection? Have you incited violence? And that's the only way we take any kind of action against online speech. Whereas there's a whole bunch of stuff that's happened in between the online speech and like murder that are bad.
We joke about IRL versus URL, right? Like URL online
Yeah.
and IRL in real life.
But that distinction is so blurred, right? Like, especially in this past year when almost all of our interactions have been digital. Like,
Yeah.
there's
Oh
not
yeah.
really a
So
big
then it
difference
is the whole
between
thing's
online.
IRL. Weirdly, even though it's online.
Right.
But you said something I had never thought of, and it's this concept of basically when this First Amendment was written, and for hundreds of years, it was people can say whatever they want because it's just noise. There wasn't like streamlined ways to communicate, and then freedom of the press was part of it as well. But now you're talking about other parts of freedom of speech that are almost uniquely on the internet. So like it's one thing for one person to start shouting hate speech at the top of a mountain or saying something mean. It's another thing if they're talking to 20,000, 100,000, a million people, because that's like that's like an assembly, and it may not be peaceful based on that language. And then in the internet, you're not just talking about words. You could be talking about pictures and videos and animation and God knows what.
This problem that we're facing is so big that we have to reconceptualize all of governance. And I think it's a phase shift that's as significant as, say, going from tribal communities to feudal states, or feudal states with like monarchy to modern liberal democracies. Like, this is a very big transition in how all of society functions. And just quibbling about like one particular law doesn't feel like it's going to get us to where we need to be in terms of governance. And one other thing I would point out is
There.
the rules that determine how people interact come in a few forms. So there's laws where we have this idea that like laws are very strong, and if they're violated, they will be enforced by some form of punishment or fines, or there's some kind of enforcement there. But most of what people do in the offline world is not just skirting the edge of what's legal or not. There are also social norms around like what is acceptable behavior and how do I want to behave amongst other people. And I pick up cues from others around me. So even if things aren't illegal, I won't necessarily do them.
Much easier to shout someone on Twitter than to actually look someone in the eye and say the same thing. Most of this stuff, like for example, the people that would hate on Hillary Clinton, I would just beg many of them to look her in the eye as a human being and say that, because Hillary is a very impressive person, right? Like, and
Yeah.
like his stuff, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So I'm saying like there's a stuff that should be clearly delineated as this is not acceptable. And if you violate these rules, there will be repercussions to it. There's that set of things that we probably need to be a bit stronger on. Right now, there's very little governance of anything happening
There's no
online,
real consequences just being an asshole on the internet.
and the fact that like even some of the things that are delineated as not acceptable don't get enforced that way means that people implicitly understand that they can still get away with doing things that are not allowed.
It's frowned upon. Slap on the wrist.
So there's that set of things, but I think there's also quite a bit that we need to do in terms of setting better norms online. So maybe it's not enforceable in a way, but it's enforceable in the sense of like the community may shun you, or you may be looked down upon, or like we evolve social norms that are just better for interacting with each other. And sure, there may be some range of what people personally find acceptable or not. Like just like in the offline world, you'll see people who are nicer or ruder, and it's all like within some general distribution of like what is appropriate social behavior. Talk about Future of Censorship, for example. Censorship, maybe that's defining like the absolute worst things that you're not allowed to say, but I think that's a very limiting way of looking at all of our online systems and how people interact and are participants in a digital ecosystem, a digital society. It's not just defined by what are the worst things that you're not allowed to do, but also like where are the norms and what are people expecting in terms of interaction with each other.
Where it's just socially acceptable behaviors on the internet. And right now it's the Wild West, where there's nothing that's technically not socially acceptable because everything is just a mess. Where like there's stuff you say online that you could never get away with in person because whether it's common sense or common decency or whatever we've all agreed to as like rule of law and like social norms, it's unacceptable.
You mentioned this idea of like the Wild West. I think that's a very good metaphor to use as well. When you look at the lack of enforcement, the lack of laws and justice, and in that environment, we kind of see mob justice or vigilante justice. And I think what people often will call cancel culture fits into that, where because there's no real system of enforcement that we can trust, like there's no law enforcement that we think will, in most cases, when there are violations, like go and follow through on the enforcement. We end up having individual citizens piling on to one person who does something that's deemed not acceptable. And the punishment in those cases ends up often being pretty disproportionate to what the original supposed crime was. And it just feels very imperfect because you do want there to be some accountability. And so you get the sense of like, okay, this person said something that was very inappropriate. They did something that was inappropriate. They should be held to account. But because there's not a good system of justice, when you have a huge pile on from the entire internet, it does feel a little bit over the top. And so we go from like no accountability to way too much accountability in certain cases, in most cases, none. And I think the solution is not like, let's get rid of accountability. It's like, how do we design a better system of governance and law and enforcement so that the accountability is commensurate with the
Yes.
like
Like
infraction.
if you made a terrible tweet in your teens, if you behaved inappropriately at a party, there are consequences for those actions and they should exist. Does it mean that you should be unemployable the rest of your life? Except by like far right-wing organizations? Like probably not, right?
Yeah,
Like that's,
right.
we all make mistakes. Hell, I do all the time. And I'm sure I'll be canceled over and over. And it's frustrating. And then on the other hand, it's like, okay, but Harvey Weinstein was a disaster, so that guy needs to go to jail. Like, so there's like, there is a middle ground, which the internet doesn't really like to have right now. We don't really love nuance. Let me ask you this. I'm just going to come off as an asshole question, so I'm going to preface it by saying I'm asking this in a human way, as nicely as I can. Do you think we're too sensitive as a society, particularly on the internet, in the sense of, like, I grew up like sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me, right? Like we're all out here and people are like, oh, I'm getting bullied or there's harassment. But the reality is like, it's just dumb people saying mean things. The type of person it takes to say some of the comments you were mentioning that harassed you. Like to me, I'm like, well, who cares about that person? He's clearly, or she, probably usually he, a sociopath, pay them no mind, move on. So that's like where maybe sometimes I lean, but other times we have people going the complete opposite. Like, this is a travesty. We have to do all these things. And have we built ourselves up to be too sensitive, to overreact at times? Like, what are your thoughts on kind of the general sensitivity level of your internet users and the press, I think, too?
I think there's kind of subtext to this question, which is the context and a collapse of context. And when you frame that question, you pose that question, I immediately think of different people's reactions to certain things given what context they are in. So for example, if we're talking about like negative comments, maybe one negative comment you can brush off and it's not that big a deal. You can just say like, ignored the trolls. When it happens every day, all day, it's very difficult to shake that off. And I think when you have folks who don't experience the sort of like persistent harassment, only looking at individual examples, the response to just shake it off is not understanding the context of like dealing with this nonstop. And I think there is a very real mental health impact. And it's maybe a bit more understandable for folks who have dealt with it a lot to say like, oh, when you point out one bad tweet,
are you kidding me? Just shake it off. Do you see what's in my timeline right now? Like, you shake this off, asshole.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. So there's a pretty big difference there. Like, I could show you a couple of the tweets I've had to see over the last couple of days, and they might all seem fine. Or like it's easy to brush it off, but in the context of like dealing with this for, I don't know how many, like over 10 years, and a lot of it, and sometimes it's huge pylons, it feels very different. Another analogy I have heard sometimes is like, if somebody steps on your foot by accident and you respond really negatively, they may say like, "Why are you so upset? Like, why are you so sensitive? Like, I just accidentally stepped on your foot. Like, you don't need to like get upset at me." But if you're the person whose foot got stepped on and you've been stepped on like thousands of times and your foot is sore already, then when this other person like accidentally steps on you, it already hurts. And it's a huge pattern of problematic behavior and hurt that you have accrued. And so the responses feel different and they feel mismatched, and like both sides may feel upset at the other because they're just operating from different contexts. I think that is important to call out. We have such different experiences, and maybe something that's worse about the online world is that it can be harder to understand what someone else is dealing with. So like, I don't know what your notifications look like on Twitter. You don't know what mine look like. It's harder for me to have an understanding of what you may be dealing with, or for you likewise. Versus in the real world, if we're sitting in the same room, or if we're standing in the same room and I see a bunch of people like come over to you and are shouting mean things, I can get a sense of like you're dealing with a lot right now. And it's harder to see that online, or you can't see DMs very easily of other folks online. So these private messages, these direct messages, they're meant to be one-on-one communication. So nobody else has access to what you're seeing. And so you don't really know like what other crap somebody is dealing with privately, versus in the offline world, when people are harassing you on the street, the passersby can kind of see that there's somebody there. They can overhear the shouting or that kind of thing. So a lot of this context collapses online.